Welcome to our Zession. If you're new here, we are so excited that you are here with us today. And if you're joining us again, thank you so much for being here again and also for your ongoing support. We're so grateful that you are a part of our Zesho community. My name is Mandy Rourke, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in Austin, Texas, and I am also one of the co-founders of Zesho.
And I'm Dr. Sapna Srivastav. And like Mandy said, we are co-founders of Zesho. And in our podcast sessions, we're having conversations amongst clinicians. We talk about topics typically addressed in the mental health world so that there's the perspective of clinicians who support clients daily, readily available to all of you.
Yes, and today Sapna and I are going to be nerding out about something that is very, very near and dear to our hearts and our work. And our topic is how to have vulnerable and productive conversations. We may get a little vulnerable as we have it, and we hope that it will be a productive conversation for you to listen to and or share with anyone. And just a little bit of background, this is a topic that comes up in and out of therapy. And so we're going to be diving into the many different layers that exist when it comes to having these conversations, because it does tend to take some preparation, some thought, some intention. And as we're talking about this, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that both Sapna and I are marriage and family therapists. So we tend to share examples that are relationally driven, a lot of times them being either family relationships or romantic relationships. And so we just want to acknowledge from the start that what we're talking about today can be applied to really any relationship, be it professional relationships or even personal relationships. So just wanted to give you that heads up from the start.
Yes. And before we truly dive in here, a little bit of housekeeping. If you do enjoy our content, please do consider liking, following, giving positive ratings or reviews on any and all podcast platforms that you listen on. These ratings and reviews really help us out in helping more people to find us. And that way, more people can hopefully benefit from these resources that we're trying to make more accessible. Additionally, you can also follow us and connect with us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. You can find us at My Zesho. That's Zessio. And you can also find more mental health resources at our website. That's zesho.com, Zessio.com.
Boom. Got it. So let's dive in. When we talk about, or when we're referring to vulnerable conversations, we mean something very specific. And I think before we even say, like, what does it mean to have a vulnerable conversation, we want to define what vulnerability is. And we're using Brene Brown's definition. And her definition of vulnerability is that vulnerability is it's uncertainty, it's risk, it's emotional exposure. She is a researcher on vulnerability and shame, so we're definitely going to be referencing her stuff in this episode. It just makes perfect sense for us to do that. But one of the key things that stands out in this definition for me, and Sapna definitely jump in, is that vulnerability is feeling exposed, like you've got, your armor is kind of taken off and you're just there as real and as authentic as you can be, really sharing kind of the depths of what your personal experience is. What does vulnerability mean to you if something different, Sabna?
Yeah, no, it's very similar. I think kind of going on the shields being brought down, it's kind of like, animals showing their underbelly whenever, that's their most vulnerable area. If anything were to happen to them, they could easily be wounded or killed or what have you. That's a little bit of an extreme example, but my meaning is like feeling kind of like you're showing your underbelly, like you could really be hurt or wounded in sharing this information and having this conversation. There's a likelihood of that, but there's also the likelihood of connection and deepened understanding between you and that other person as well. And so there's a lot of fear and uncertainty there, like we said, but there's also a lot of possibility of love and connection as well.
I love that. And it actually, as you say that, it feels kind of comforting in some way, aside from the whole like being under attack or being killed part.
Right.
Which, one thing just to reference, and Brene Brown talks about this a lot, is that vulnerability is not weakness. It may feel like you're in that kind of weaker position, like you said, as your underbelly is showing, but it is not weakness. It's actually a sign of courage. And so we want to help you have some ideas around how to have these courageous conversations in a very productive way. And one quote I really wanted to share in this podcast today, I read it as we were preparing for this, is from Brene Brown, of course. This is from her book, Daring Greatly. And the quote is, yes, we are totally exposed when we are vulnerable. Yes, we are in the torture chamber that we call uncertainty. And yes, we're taking a huge emotional risk when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But there's no equation where taking risks, braving uncertainty, and opening ourselves up to emotional exposures equals weakness. And that quote just hit hard because this is something that Sapna and I could probably talk about this for hours and hours on end because we help clients hours and hours on end when it comes to vulnerability and shifting the perspective around it may feel weak, but it's also like the bravest thing that you can do is by leaning into that vulnerability. So first, maybe we should share some examples of vulnerability and to kind of get the conversation going about vulnerable conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, benefiting from Brene Brown's excellent research, she talks about asking her participants what vulnerability is, what are examples. And some of them shared vulnerability is sharing an unpopular opinion, standing up for myself, asking for help, being accountable, saying no, starting my own business, saying I love you first and not knowing if I'm going to be loved back, asking for forgiveness,
Yeah.
and yeah, any others that you would have?
Well, in our preparation too, I kind of wanted to get a list. Like, I think it's helpful to be like, what is vulnerability? Because I was kind of laughing about this. I don't know. I mean, I'm ashamed to admit that the Bachelor series that I've watched too many hours of back in the day, I have retired myself of that, just side note. But it's
No
just
shame.
come.
No shame.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. I feel vulnerable in sharing that actually. But there tends to be just this like it's almost like turning into a catchphrase, like I'm being vulnerable, I'm being vulnerable. And it kind of drives me bananas because I'm like, what exactly do you mean by vulnerability? And so when we were looking at different types of vulnerability, I do want to share this list because as we're having this conversation, I think it would be helpful for you to get curious about what might be your or where might your areas of vulnerability lie, or what are some of those core vulnerabilities that you experience? So I'm going to kind of just go down this bullet list. Fear of rejection or abandonment is a big one I see showing up a ton in therapy, whether that be emotional abandonment, sexual rejection, intimacy rejection, self-doubt or insecurity, anxiety or nervousness. I already mentioned intimacy, but intimacy issues or fear of being hurt, feeling exposed or uncomfortable, which is what we're talking about with vulnerability exactly, sensitivity to criticism or judgment, the inability to trust others, feeling overwhelmed or helpless, or loneliness or isolation. And that's a pretty good list, but it's not an exclusive list. There's definitely, I'm sure, there's a lot more vulnerabilities that people experience, but this is just to kind of get those wheels turning as we have our conversation.
Yeah.
Within that, so we're kind of talking about vulnerability here, of like these are some examples of vulnerability, but our whole approach to today's conversation is around what is a vulnerable conversation. So to define that, for me, a vulnerable conversation is having intentional, responsive conversations that involves emotional preparation. So to be a little bit more wordy here, it is really being considerate about there's something that's pulling at me. There's something that I have a big emotional feeling around, and I need to discuss this. But rather than just discussing it, in order to make it productive, we have to be intentional about preparing and understanding what is our vulnerability and how can we express this in a way that can be received, or that some action can be taken, or some change can result in those conversations.
Yeah, they're conversations that feel really difficult to have oftentimes. They don't always feel, again, there's that uncertainty there that's involved with it. And they do take kind of some stealing of yourself sometimes, of feeling ready to have that conversation or bring it up. Unless it just explodes sometimes, unless we just become reactive and it explodes and comes out,
Mhm.
which we'll talk about a little bit too.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, just being really intentional about ideally having those conversations and being able to meet our own needs by sharing them with others oftentimes as well.
And in addition to that, something we'll touch on later is how do we embrace vulnerable conversations when someone comes to you,
Mhm.
with that, with them exposing their own vulnerability, because oftentimes it's hard to know how to navigate those because that person's coming to you exposed, which can then in response make you feel a little exposed because you're like, okay, like we've entered into, even as I'm saying this, like my temperature is rising a bit because it's like, oh, okay, this isn't just a typical conversation. This is something that means something deeper. It's below the surface type of conversation, and it
Mhm.
matters. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. One thing that I think it's helpful for us to start addressing is, how do vulnerable conversations, or just this whole topic, come up in the context of therapy? In your work in therapy, Sapna, how do you experience this topic in therapy?
It's there on so many levels, right? I mean, just the process of therapy is in itself a vulnerable process and conversation. And then within that, we're doing a whole meta, like in having a vulnerable conversation, we're talking about how to be vulnerable with others and how to address that both with ourselves and with others for that matter, because sometimes it's hard just acknowledging our own vulnerability within ourselves, let alone with other people. And so it's really helping folks kind of understand what's going on for them internally. What are those vulnerability issues that they're feeling, and kind of the things that suppress it oftentimes, or are trying to protect it and are not, and how we can help them to feel safer acknowledging that both with themselves and with others.
Mhm. I see it happening. I mean, this is a big source, like a big source of my work, really. I mean, in couples therapy, I primarily support couples, but I also support individuals with relationship, whether that be with their family, friends, professional, romantic. And it's really it's honorable to be able to sit with clients, to be able to understand what their challenges are behind these, having these conversations, because I'll admit, being a therapist, I feel like we get really comfortable talking about deep stuff, and it's something that we've gone through a lot of training around it. We've had a lot of consultation groups where you have to expose yourself, and so it's something that we're practicing all day and every day. It's something that we practice with our clients, something that we practice in our own relationships, because it's just such a hot topic and such an essential area for relationship connection and intimacy. But I see it come up every single day in different contexts in therapy. I do feel like it can be pretty challenging sometimes, though, when I am supporting individuals around how to have vulnerable conversations, because as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, there are kind of some conditions that need to be met in order for someone to be able to expose themselves with another, and for that to feel safe and, again, productive in them doing so. What are some other things that come to mind too, as far as like the therapy context for vulnerability?
Yeah, well, I was just going to go back to your um you're pointing out that we have become maybe overly comfortable with vulnerable conversations at
Mhm.
times. And so just a reminder to kind of, if at any point we make this sound like and feel like it's very easy, like take it with multiple grains of salt. It is
Mhm.
not easy at all whatsoever. And we're also talking about it more so in a therapeutic context rather than, we'll sometimes talk about it in our own lives, but oftentimes we're going to be talking about it in more of a therapeutic context. And it looks very different when it's in our personal lives as well. Um, but therapeutically, yeah, it's really challenging to sometimes have people acknowledge that vulnerability to begin with. And usually it's kind of shame or fear kind of blocking that. And really, it's often acknowledging that shame and seeing what it's rooted in to be able to finally uncover the vulnerability and the courage to become more vulnerable so that shame isn't just magnifying the reasons why we shouldn't. And again, that sounds really abstract. Trying to think of like,
Well, this is kind of what pops to mind whenever you're saying that, if I could jump
yeah,
in.
please.
It makes me think about a couple that I'm supporting where the surface level emotion that you're hearing and seeing loudly and often is anger. And that is a tricky emotion to navigate, whether that be in a relationship with a romantic partner or whatever relationship. And so, a lot of what I feel like our work is in couple sessions or even individual sessions is to get really curious around, okay, it might be really easy for me to react with anger and start yelling, but a lot of my work is really trying to help clients get below the surface to understand what is actually fueling that. And that's something that we can work with. We can manage anger, we can talk about how to manage that reactivity, and that's definitely a part of our work. But in order for there to be that, as therapists refer to as like second order change, we have to get into what is that vulnerability that's being triggered right now. And in the case I'm thinking of, it's this fear of abandonment, a deep, deep fear of abandonment. So that goes back to what you're describing, right, as fear. And so that vulnerability of fear can show up and be disguised oftentimes as anger. And it can be a deterrent for connection when we only act out on that initial feeling versus getting really curious of what do I feel most vulnerable here? I feel like my partner is going to leave me or that I am going to be alone. And that's that isolation again around vulnerability. And so I see it come up in therapy a lot to help clients be able to, kind of play around with their emotions a little bit, if you will, of like, let me just get more curious about what else is happening here. Like, what else is that pulling at? Because what it's pulling at is likely going to be that core vulnerability. And then that helps us understand what the needs are. What do I need when I feel this fear of abandonment or I feel alone in this relationship? How we can work with that, right? And again, we can still work with the anger too, but it feels more beneficial long term to really get into like, what am I crying out? Because when I'm screaming out, I'm kind of crying out. It's just disguised.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all huge. Exactly. Really just getting under the surface. I think that's a great way of kind of encapsulating it, right? Of there's going to be what we tend to call um secondary emotions. So anger is a very good example of oftentimes a secondary emotion. Fun fact, sometimes anger can be a primary emotion in that it's protecting you. Um, but oftentimes anger is a secondary emotion in that it's protecting other primary, more vulnerable emotions of sadness, fear, unworthiness, rejection, those types of things. And so really helping clients to get under the surface a little bit more in a safe way at their own pace. And whether it's individually or couples, and like you said, it can be harder with individuals sometime if they're trying to prepare to have a vulnerable conversation, because ideally we can, with couples, have conversations to make it understood of how to make the conversation safer, how to make allow for vulnerability for both parties. Whereas with individuals, we only have one party available, and we can't guarantee that the other party has the information, has the ability or the capacity to make that conversation safe to allow for the vulnerability as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
One thing too, I think it's skill based, if you will, as far as therapy is concerned, because as I was sharing before, I'm continuously learning how to be vulnerable and show up for people that are vulnerable. It's a practice that never ends, but key word is it's a practice. And
Mm.
so what are you practicing though? You're practicing a skill, I think. And I
Mhm.
think that it seems like, I mean, this is anecdotal just in my years of experience and supporting clients of it's pretty natural to be other focused of
Mhm.
this is what this person's making me feel, or this is what this person is doing that I don't like, and this is what I want them to stop or start. And it comes up in therapy to help them shift that approach from it being other focused to self focused, which is helping them develop that skill of attunement, that self attunement into I feel something very big right now and it's pulling at me. So how can I really understand what that is pulling at versus the tendency that is so natural and no shame in that or criticism in that. But rather than it being blaming and that other focus to really help like clients learn how to be very self-focused to help with the productivity of having conversations. And we'll get into this more and more, so I don't want to jump ahead, but maybe I should jump ahead right now with with this kind of question of like what happens when we are trying to, or when a vulnerable conversation is being had that's unproductive. Like what are some of the risks, right? Like what can be detrimental when those vulnerable conversations aren't had productively?
Yeah. So, for example, if a conversation is had and either a partner brings up something vulnerable and it's not met, with respect or adherence to allowing that vulnerability, it's either shut down or it's rejected or it's judged or it's criticized, what have you. It can really create some emotional wounds in that interaction, in that relationship. Um, and oftentimes, also, conversely, if the vulnerable conversations are not brought up at all, it can cause buildup of emotions that can just one day just blow up and explode and come out without that intentionality that we talked about. It can also just cause a buildup of resentment too, of like, I don't feel like I can have this conversation with you if you constantly make it about yourself. Or I don't feel like I can have this conversation with you because you automatically shut down whenever I bring up something that's about me. Um, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are just a couple examples of how conversations can happen unproductively
Mhm.
in that way. Anything else that you think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of leads into like what not to do as you're saying that I'm already starting to kind of think about tips that we would share around if you are feeling like we're saying in a vulnerable position and you need to address it. What not to do is to what John Gottman and his research would share is to have a harsh startup around that. And basically, what that means is kind of coming in hot, is the way I like to say it, where it's like, WTF, why did you do that? Or what's wrong with you? And kind of just starting it very harshly, as it says. He also has what's referred to as the four horsemen, and we'll include all this stuff in the show notes too. So you can reference it again. But the four horsemen are the kind of four types of behaviors that will cause likely some unproductive conversations, escalated conflict, the wounds like you're referring to, the disconnect. And those four horsemen are contempt, criticism, stonewalling, and defensiveness. And so it's the idea of, someone comes to me from a vulnerable state, and let's say I immediately react by just defending my position. That person could be coming to me because they have been intentional and thoughtful about like I really need to talk about this with the person I love, and then if I meet them with that defensiveness, that's immediately this disconnect and can create that wound within the relationship. Within that, you also see that blaming dynamic, which kind of comes into that other focused of you're doing this to make me feel this way. And so those are just from the top of, as we are starting to talk about this, like what not to do, because that tends to start creating or start resulting with a escalation of, oh, wait, I came to, I'm already exposed here, trying to have a conversation about something. Um, but again, if I come in harshly about that, then there's a chance of that blowing up and for kind of the whole message to be just lost in translation. So that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind of like what not to do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not to say that don't do these things because they're very hard not to do, honestly. It's a little more, at least starting off as like um just recognizing when they're happening, even if it's in hindsight. Again, that definitely is a good place to start, but starting to recognize maybe a little bit more as you start to understand, for example, these Gottman's four horsemen of the apocalypse of like, okay, I was being a little critical here. I could have been a little more gentler, or I was showing some contempt. I was being pretty insulting, and you know, I could be more appreciative, or um, I was being really defensive and felt like I was being blamed and kind of was taking the role of the victim a little bit. I could take a little more accountability. Or with stonewalling, kind of, I just shut down completely and withdrew from the conversation. Maybe that's my signal that I need a break, type of thing.
Mhm.
And so just starting to recognize those and ideally moving away from those or noticing it when they're happening in the moment so that you can switch them up, you can change them. Um, but also things that tend to happen and are not helpful for vulnerable conversations is kind of that blaming mentality that you're mentioning. Another indicator of when we're doing that is if we start to say like, you always or you never, anytime those always or nevers come up, that's usually an indicator that some kind of criticism is involved, and it's not usually fair. It's there's rare moments where using always or never as a blanket statement is going to be accurate. So for example, you always think the worst of me, or you never give me the benefit of the doubt. Like usually, maybe it feels like majority of the time, but it's not always. Um, Even just when you're not calm and you're riled up and you're getting
Mhm.
angry and angrier, and you and the other person might be like building off of each other's anger and it's just getting bigger and bigger and escalating, like we definitely want to kind of calm that down. That's not going to be helpful in actually having a productive conversation if we're in those inside of those big emotions and not able to step away from them. As well as like interrupting, not letting someone else or the other person get their point across or finish their thought or even get a word in edgewise. It's really easy to assume and jump to conclusions, especially when we're starting to get defensive. And so slowing those down and recognizing when that's happening a little bit and being like, I'm making this assumption here based on what you said. Is that accurate? And kind of being able to start to listen a little bit more, um, being reactive. I'm gonna let you talk about that a little bit of like what that can look like.
I think that goes back to what you're talking about with being riled up, or another way of describing it, of like that emotional dysregulation, where it's like I'm triggered, I'm activated, this conflict has escalated. And I work with a lot of high conflict couples. And so the common theme is that when someone is having that very big emotional experience, a lot of times it is a vulnerable place. Like it doesn't feel good to be, like almost like smoke's coming out of your ears and you're crying out for your partner to hear you. Like that doesn't feel good. And it probably does feel vulnerable most of the time, but also it's not a productive time to have a conversation. But I do seem to notice that whether that be in my own relationship or even in the relationships that I support, that is like, no, I want to have the conversation now. It feels important to have it now because I am so riled up and this is so important to me. However, that is usually not a time where a vulnerable conversation can take place because we're dealing with more of those, what we'd refer to as like survival strategies. It's like almost from an interpersonal neuropsychology perspective, it's like we feel as if we are actively under attack, like we're on a battlefield here. This is some of Stan Tatkin's work, which I love. Just side note, real quick, that's a Wired for Love book. I recommend it to everybody. Um, but it just is important for clients and people just to understand that sometimes we have so much energy in those moments or so much like passion behind how we're feeling. And it's like, now is the time to talk about this. This is the like, I am being vulnerable. I'm sharing what I need and everything. But the problem is that when two people's systems are in this dance of that dysregulation or that sense of riled up and kind of the fighting stance of I feel threatened and I'm trying to fight for my safety. I feel viscerally like I have to protect myself. It's really hard to get below the surface there because a lot of that energy is around just the emotional reaction in itself. And so that's one thing that, as we're talking about like kind of what not to do, it's more of like what to do, which I think we're kind of starting to transition into that a little bit here of like, get clear around how can we set some conditions here for that vulnerability or those vulnerable conversations to actually take place. And so it's, a lot of times in therapy, we think about like the positive of like, what are we working towards versus what are we working against? So as we're sitting here saying like, here's what not to do, let's start talking now about like, here's what to do though, going forward. So just to finish that thought, let's think about the conditions that we need to set in order for a vulnerable conversation to have place or take place. And the conditions that I believe have to be set are it's calm conditions, right? Like maybe we felt like very, very stormy weather and it's like torrential downpour and we're feeling everything that we possibly can. The wind is ripping us apart. It feels terrible. And so we have to be able to say, like, let's go take some shelter. Let's take some space for a second and let's try to calm and self-soothe so that we can get to a place where we can actually open up and say, wow, that was a really hard storm that we just hit. What's below the surface? Like, what's really happening here that caused such a loud, big, explosive reaction? So, to start there, those conditions are going to be key for vulnerable conversations in order for them to actually be productive, for there to be takeaways. And there are many other conditions that we want to talk about too, because we definitely want y'all to walk away from this conversation having kind of a list in your mind of, hey, I'm feeling all these big things. How do I actually have the conversation so that it's beneficial? So what else would
Yeah,
we start kind of
exactly.
diving into?
Yeah. Well, also going off of the calmness, the self-soothing, I mean, again, like recognizing that together and kind of also going back to your example of feeling like you need to have that conversation right then and there, especially when you're in the middle of that storm. Like that's often a very typical pattern of like one partner feeling like they have to have that conversation right then and there, and oftentimes the other partner probably shutting down, probably starting to stonewall a little bit, even unconditionally, I mean unintentionally rather, and really needing to like establish, okay, we need to take a break here. Let's take 20 to 30 minutes and go do something that actually calms you down, like whether it's go for a walk or, get a like angry dance in or go pet your animal or go read a book, go use some essential oils, whatever you got to do, combination of all of the above, whatever you can fit in, and set a time for when you're going to come back to the conversation. That's the piece that oftentimes couples will miss of, yeah, okay, you can take a break, but also set a time about when you're coming back to the conversation. And again, I say couples, this goes for anyone, right? If you are a parent with your child, getting really riled up and be like, okay, I think we need to take a break. Let's even take it separately and come back here, meet in the living room at, 200 hours, whatever, and, have that conversation again. Um, Additionally, I think also making sure that there is some level of safety with the other person that you're wanting to have a vulnerable conversation with. And what we mean by that is you don't necessarily owe anything to someone who hasn't earned the right to hear what's going on for you and what your story is and your experiences are. So ideally, hopefully you're dealing with someone who has earned that. But sometimes there's situations where that's not quite the case, particularly like professionally, for example. If you have to share something that's going on in your life that's affecting your performance, whether it's something in your family life or your health or what have you, wanting to make sure that there's a level of safety with that person that you're sharing that with your boss or your supervisor or what have you. And if not, like sharing only the details that are needed that aren't necessarily, mm, you know, putting you in a vulnerable situation. With loved ones, I would hope there's some level of safety and trust, but that's for you to decide and make sure that you have at least a baseline level of that. And, continuing to add on these conditions that we're talking about so that hopefully they can foster the best environment for having a vulnerable conversation with someone. Um, so hopefully a space that's judgment free for the most part, where there can be some kind of validation, where there's empathy and acknowledgement. Hopefully, there can be some active listening. Curiosity is huge. You and I talked a lot about curiosity both today in preparation for this, but we also have an entire other podcast episode on curiosity that's actually pretty relevant to this.
Yeah.
And I think is definitely a big step in being able to foster vulnerable conversations. Um, what else on your end?
Yeah, I mean, something I talk about with a lot of the couples that I work with and individuals too in relationships is considering timing is pretty huge. I think that it can be hard when you have something that's really pressing on you and you want to talk about, but also, I mean, the scenario that kind of comes into my head right now is, let's say that I'm upset about something that had happened, the day before, and it's been eating at me all day, and I want to address it with my partner. And then I notice that my partner, has had a stressful day, and, maybe stuff at work had been really challenging, and maybe my partner felt like they were being attacked at work or whatever it may be. It was high levels of stress. Probably not the right time for me to have the conversation with my partner. It's probably not going to be as productive if I am hoping for an outcome of, like you're just referring to, that compassion and that understanding. And so it's not to say like sacrifice and never bring it up. It's more around, again, we're talking about conditions of like what conditions kind of need to be set. It's really being considerate of both people here. It's not, so it's like a balance between the self-focus, but also having a little bit of other focus to the extent of, is this a good time to have this conversation? And I talk about this with my couples a lot of, how can you kind of read where they're at? If they're in a calm headspace, they've had enough rest, they're not hangry, they're not in the overly stressed or taxed place. Maybe you're going for a morning walk and it's a time just to say, hey, I noticed that this happened and I really wanted to talk to you about it. Is now a good time? Even kind of giving a little bit of a heads up, like I there's something that's kind of pulling at me whenever we're both in a place where we can talk about it. I would love to connect with you and talk about that. So kind of going back to what we were talking about before, it's the very softened approach of, hey, this is what is going on for me. When is a good time for us to talk about this versus making um maybe not even an assumption. Maybe it's more of like just reacting to, I've got something to say, I feel something very strongly, and you got to listen because, you know, this is important to me. And
Yeah.
so it is like a shared consideration of like, is this the right time for this to be beneficial again for growth or for connection or for understanding and compassion. So that's going to be, I think, a very big like predictor for the success of the productive, vulnerable conversations.
Yeah. And I also want to acknowledge that there's going to be definitely instances where timing is not able to necessarily be something that you're able to choose. And so in those instances, I think kind of like what you were saying, just being able to prepare and like do the soft startup and be like, hey, I know this is not the best time. I know you're dealing with a lot. Maybe do some of the more validation, right? Start with the validation. Like, I know you've had a really, really tough day, but we have our window right now before we have to go get the kids or what have you. Like, I really would like to have this conversation with you, and I don't know when else we'd get a time to after this. So do you feel like you can have this conversation right now? And maybe even just being direct about it that way, or share it as a preview of like, um I really am having this issue with you know the way that you don't do the dishes, which is not the way to phrase it. We're going to go over that here soon too. I really need more help around the house or what have you. um And so ideally choosing the timing as much as possible, or at least considering the other person's capacity. Um, but really being soft in that startup. We're going to talk more about that here soon too.
Well,
Um,
and so, the key thing we're trying to hone in on here is like, how do we help people have vulnerable conversations? And a big part of this is processing through the fears in having a conversation. Because even as you're just describing that, I mean, I could see where it's like, I don't know if there's ever a good time to talk to my partner about this stuff, right? I could talk to them when we're out on a morning walk and we've had sex 18 times and the day, whatever, like all systems would check, check, check. This would be the ideal time. And it's not necessarily that, right? And it can turn into, there's some real fear here of like, what are they going to be met with when they approach their client? And so a lot of how we help clients, or I'll speak for myself, is like, what are your fears in having that conversation? Because that's actually probably going to be informative for us around what are some of your vulnerabilities and your fears of how that person might react. Well, what does that pull on within you? And so that's a big part of this too, for everyone, just to get curious around, what's causing some hesitation. For instance, I can think about clients that I've supported in the past that have hesitated to have a conversation with their partner when, as we're talking about like conditions for safety, check, like intimacy, check. Like it's almost like all the conditions are kind of met here. However, there is still a real hesitation to go below the surface. Maybe it's because they've had times where that's blown up in the past. And so it's like the past could predict the future. And I don't want to have to run into that same, disappointment that I was met with last time, or that same painful reaction that I was met with my client, or sorry, with my partner. And so I think that that's a big part of our work too, of like, what are you worried you're going to be met with? Because I have had lots of clients that have been met with judgment or shame or minimization of what's happening. And so it's helping them feel, as, how do I describe this? As prepared as possible to, in the event that you are met with that, how can you then respond? Or what would be your way of attending to that if that happens? And so that's a huge piece of this too.
yeah, absolutely. I think definitely being able to understand what are the things that prevent you from having those conversations can also be the things that are indicators of like the minefields, if you will, of when you are having those conversations. If someone were to purposely or accidentally step on this minefield of shame that you have around, um, you know, how, I'm trying to think of an example, personal example, how slow you tend to go in getting ready. We talked about this in the anxiety podcast. We already know this. Um, that could be a shame trigger in any conversation potentially. Not we've worked through that a lot, but it's a journey. Anyways. But understanding kind of what are the things that do prevent us from necessarily having those vulnerable conversations oftentimes, and particularly with that person, for example, as well, can be really helpful in understanding, like, I'm afraid of experiencing judgment from other people for, not meeting the usual typical standards of what people expect as far as time goes, or, you know, um, of the other person shutting down and not wanting to have that conversation with me because that triggers their anxiety or what have you. There's many, many things that can kind of prevent us from having those vulnerable conversations,
Mhm.
and kind of processing through that yourself and or with the help of a professional can be really helpful. Um, there's also the piece of preparing emotionally, and I want to also canvas all of these, like these conditions, and processing through fears. I mean, maybe that's a little bit different, but the conditions and this emotional preparedness that we're talking about, like we're helping to foster the best environment that we can for having these conversations. And at the same time, there's only so much that is in your control. Some of this isn't always going to be in your control. There's definitely two people involved in these kinds of conversations, sometimes more than two people,
Mhm.
if it's a family conversation or group conversation or what have you. So do keep that in mind of like, this is what we suggest, but it's not always going to be realistic in all cases necessarily.
Mhm.
But when we're saying emotional preparedness, what are we kind of meaning?
Well, I think I mean, that could almost be a blanket statement for everything we're talking about here. It's like we're preparing through the conditions, through processing and everything. So, um, emotional preparedness to me means we are getting curious again and we're assessing for like what is my own core vulnerability here that I need to attend to. And I think part of that is also, as you were just describing, it's a two-way dance with another person, or maybe it's like a three or four-way with multiple people involved, right? Of like, I need to attend to what my emotional experience is, and I need to get really clear around what my vulnerabilities are and where I might get triggered even. And with that, I think this goes into some of Dan Siegel's work of mind to sight, which is like, I need to understand what my internal C is, but I also need to be considerate of the internal C of the person that I'm talking with as well. So, kind of pulling this together as far as how to prepare. I also need to be thoughtful about if I'm coming to someone with my own vulnerable needs, I need to be thoughtful about what that might trigger within their own vulnerabilities because, some of the fears that we may have in these vulnerable conversations and them being productive are, I'm just coming to them telling them how I feel about something. Well, if I'm saying I feel, that our intimacy is suffering, that could trigger a feeling of inadequacy within the partner, for instance. And so then it's like we're doing this dance where like both of these vulnerabilities could be potentially at war without just a very clear, like we're preparing and we're being really gentle and really soft again around how to get again, below the surface of what is it that I'm feeling? Also, what might my partner or my friend also be experiencing here too? And so that's going to be kind of that's where my mind goes when I think about emotional preparedness. And there's a lot there, right? We're talking about the internal sea of ourselves, the internal sea of others, and again, it goes back to intentionality behind that and taking time to get real thorough in that process versus just like this is what I'm feeling. I'm going to go ahead and say it because that's usually not going to be productive, like we've acknowledged.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of, we've mentioned kind of the softened startup, so let's maybe expand on that a little bit. And also, I apologize, there's yard work happening where I'm at, so hopefully my mic is not picking that up, but apologies if it is. So the softened startup, again, that's basically the opposite of the harsh startup that Mandy was talking about earlier. And starting the conversation in a way that's softer and a little bit more gentle. And we've given a couple examples already of like, hey, there's something that's been weighing on me a little bit. Would love to talk to you more about it. When is a good time for us? Or do you have the capacity right now? Um, it's not, the whole like, oh my God, you keep doing this to me. Like, that's why I keep feeling this and this and this. It's really just being like really focusing on yourself, that self-focus, and allowing the shields to be a little bit lower. Honestly, a soft startup is vulnerable in and of itself, oftentimes, right? Of like being more gentle in starting the conversation, rather than um, you never listen to me. You always make these assumptions, being like, I really need to be heard and listened to right now. And I really would appreciate that from you or what have you. And that's not necessarily a startup, but kind of a way of showing an example of being soft
Yeah.
and gentle.
Kind of easing into it because we want, again, we want to be considerate of like those conditions of let's try to make this as like I'm picturing a beach now. I was picturing a thunderstorm before, but now I'm picturing like a very, very calm and peaceful beach of we're just walking down the beach, having a very calm conversation about things that matter very deeply to us, but the conditions are peaceful here.
Yeah.
And on that note, this is a big one. I think Brene Brown talks about this, and we keep going back to her, but this is maybe one of her Netflix specials she came out with, where she talks about how a lot of times those harsh startups, I don't know if she used that exact language, can happen because of the assumptions that we make, where we already have a story in our mind of, well, this must be happening. So you've already like bought into that storyline. And so then emotions have already escalated. And so it's natural for you to be pretty heightened around that, or like, as you were saying before, something like riled up, right? Of like you this or that, or whatever it may be. And so one way of leading into that kind of like ease of these conversations is to take a minute before you jump to that conclusion and just check in with that person. Like, this is the story that I'm telling myself, which is part of what we do in therapy. It's helping clients understand, like, what is the story that you're telling yourself? Because you may not even know. And that might take some time to understand that in itself. But it's like, this is the story that I'm telling myself. And let's give that person the opportunity to either say, yes, absolutely, which, oof, that feels icky and bad if it's a hard one, but maybe it's not. And a lot of times it isn't. I mean, I really do find this. I mean, even in my own personal life, there's been times where I'm like, hey, this is what I was kind of thinking. Is there a reason that maybe, like is what I'm thinking here true, or what's actually happening here? And 9 times out of 10, if not maybe 10 out of 10, it feels like I'm met with like, oh no, actually, this is what I'm thinking. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. Like that's helpful. But that is part of that preparedness, right? Of like, what is the story that I'm telling myself? And then how can I even prepare, going to what you're saying around the softening of this, of like, how do I check in about that? And how do I do that so softly that the other person is like, oh, wow, like I have some empathy for you from the start. Like, you felt that, I wasn't interested in hanging out with you, for instance. Like that's not at all the case. I've been super duper busy with work and so stressed I can't even see straight. This has nothing to do with you. And so it can help just by checking in to even attend to that emotional vulnerability that you're experiencing of maybe feeling like a burden or like not likable or unimportant or whatever it may be. So that's a huge one to really think about, as we're talking about this for yourself too.
Yeah, just to expand on that example and kind of clarify a little bit of like what we mean by what story am I telling myself? Like in that example that you just gave, Mandy, like the what you could say out loud to the other person is like the story that I've been telling myself is that I assumed you were going to initiate making plans and I haven't heard from you for 2 weeks. The story I'm telling myself is that, you're not interested in hanging out with me or hanging out with me is a burden um, or I'm not worthy of your time. And I just want to clarify, like, if that's accurate. I'm assuming it's probably not, but like, I just wanted you to know that's kind of what I've been feeling. And that might be the instance where, the other person jumps in of like, oh, I'm so sorry that you feel that way. Our wires got crossed. I thought you were gonna initiate plans. Work's been crazy for me. Like, please know that, you're always worthy of my plans, Mandy. Like,
Thank you.
I always want to hang out with you, etc. And
Mhm.
that's often kind of how those conversations can go. There are rare instances I've been like, yeah, I've been a little overwhelmed.
Mhm.
And that is that much more vulnerable for sure. And that can open up more of a conversation. That's when you got to be careful of like, what are those the minefields again, right? Of the triggers and like getting reactive in those moments if that conversation goes in that particular direction.
Oof,
Um,
because just to share the reactive version of that is like, WTF, why haven't you texted me back? Like, I guess I'll
yeah.
just blow you off from here on out because you're clearly blowing me off. And we
Right.
definitely work through that kind of stuff in therapy too. So
Yeah.
it does take work, really, and like practice.
Yep.
And I think the practice that you were already sort of doing just now is around the technique of I statements here of again, it it's not that everyone comes out of the gates and is in a blaming mindset or you focus, but it does feel pretty natural for a lot of people to be other focused because we're in relationships with others, right? And so the technique that will be really helpful to rely upon and really practice here as we think about vulnerable conversations are what you may have heard before. If not, you're probably going to hear about them a lot now that we're bringing it up, or I statements, which is how to start with I. Like, I feel this, which insert emotion because this, and trying to be objective and trying to be maybe sometimes creative with how you're expressing that so that the yous are left out. And so a little bit of a formula of like, when I see, hear, or notice this, I feel this way. Or I feel, an example, I feel worried, kind of what we were just talking about. I feel worried that I'm a burden when I text to follow up on our plans and I don't hear back. And so it's kind of a two-parter here. Like the I statements are what help get that check-in going, but it also helps you express some of that vulnerability as well. Like, I feel like a burden, or I don't feel worthy of your time whenever I don't hear back. And I'm worried that, maybe we're seeing this friendship differently. It's like, okay, well, this is a conversation we can work with here. We can, recorrect some of those storylines, or we can offer other perspectives that can help us have some takeaways in these conversations versus it being, kind of like the other example I just gave.
Yeah, speaking of the other example that you just gave, it feels like if if and when we were to operate from that kind of reactive, like, what the hell, you never texted me back, like, I thought we were going to make plans, but obviously I'm not important enough to you. Like, that's kind of the opposite version of an I statement, right?
Mhm.
And notice how if someone said that to you, you're automatically coming up on the defensive, like your hackles are starting to be raised, like you're already like, whoa, like and that doesn't make for that much of a productive conversation. Whereas the I statements can definitely help ease off that kind of blame and that criticism and that defensiveness and allow more space for accountability as well as just coming in openly. I statements are really challenging, even working with couples or individuals with those is really hard and takes a lot of practice, both often in session and outside of session. Often there's handouts that we give that people will
Mhm.
put on their fridge to kind of help them practice it more generally, or just kind of even those formulas that we just said, just to help remind them.
Mhm.
My suggestion tends to be to practice those when you are not feeling riled up, when you're feeling more calm and level-headed, and it's easier to kind of do it. And
Mhm.
hopefully that will become a lot more second nature as you progress, but it can often take a long time for that to become the case. But yeah, another example of what an I statement can
Mhm.
sound like is when I notice you on your phone while I'm talking to you, I feel a bit rejected and unheard and unvalued, and like I'm not a priority in this conversation that we're having.
Mhm.
Um, and just kind of letting the other person respond. And again, like Mandy said, ideally minimizing the use of the word you as much as
Mhm.
possible. Not always completely possible to completely eliminate it, but as little as you can use it, it'll help minimize that onset of defensiveness that can really prevent these kinds of conversations happening, and the clarification and connection that can come from those conversations.
Mhm. Yes, and I just want to normalize the fact that you just said this, Sepna, but I statements do take a lot of practice, and it's something that I talk about so much in couples therapy, individual therapy, and try to practice as much as I can in my own life. But I'm laughing because there's always a time that I'm trying to model this for a couple, and I unintentionally am like, it sounds something like, I'm just really feeling hurt because you. did da da da. Like, so I just want to say that too, because it takes like, and I'll laugh with my couples too, like, whoops, scratch that, because that's just the real part of this process that like it takes some rewiring, right? And the rewiring requires like practice and like helping that become more of a default way of how you respond. And so be gentle on yourself too, as we're talking about all this stuff, we're kind of coming to a close in this conversation today, and we hope that all of these tips will be things that maybe you've already considered them, but maybe there's some helpful ones that you can kind of think through on your own. But the key message is like, be gentle with yourself too, because again, if we're talking about vulnerability, putting you in a position where you feel exposed, it they're challenging conversations, and it does take some work, like what we've been addressing today. But the hope is that this conversation today is going to help you feel more courageous as you try to have these conversations and feel like you've kind of got your tool belt on with, okay, I got my I statements, I'm preparing, I'm setting the conditions for this to go as well as it can. And then also, I'm relinquishing some control that, like, I really don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to do my best. And that is going to be good enough because that's all we really can do. So, with that, Sapna, how do we close this out today?
Yeah, well, I was just going to point out additional resources. We'll have them in our show notes. Again, Brene Brown is a huge resource. John Gottman and the Gottman Institute
Mhm.
is also another huge resource for kind of the tips and techniques. Um, and additionally, I feel like you also have a resource, right, Mandy? It's not quite on vulnerable conversations, but I think it is reducing kind of reactivity and becoming able to be more responsive. So that's allowing more space for vulnerable conversations.
Mhm.
Would you tell us more about that a little bit?
Yes. So a couple of years ago, I just saw a need in working with a lot of my high conflict couples and noticed that there's just a natural level of emotional reactivity that happens. So it's kind of that if I feel it, I'm just going to react to it. And it would oftentimes lead to, like I said, high levels of conflict, but really it is like unproductive conversations. And so the Respond versus React course basically is a guide that is self-led. It has a lot of questions and goal setting and just a lot of reflections around, what is below the surface for me? What is causing me to feel the way I feel? And why am I reacting the way that I react so that I can get really curious, but also become prepared and focused on how I want to respond in a way that will help me have productive conversations. And also, I mean, the end goal is just to feel closer and more connected, more seen and more heard. And so it's a guide that is very self-focused, but it's also um, from couples therapy. It's like stuff I practice every single day in ways that, if you can get really good on understanding your own experience, that's really helpful for you to be able to understand again the kind of the mind of your partner, your friend, your family member, so that we can kind of slow down those harsh reactions and leave room for more of the softened, like gentle, calm, and connecting ones. So yeah, I highly encourage you to check it out. I'll give a promo code on the show notes as well. So definitely take a look.
Yeah, and definitely, ideally, at least one of you's going through it, but if you and your partner, your family member, your loved one can also go through it, it's kind of like we said, it's more ideal if more than one person involved in that conversation can also go through kind of understanding how they can be more responsive rather than reactive and
Mhm.
allow for more of that connection and meaning that Mandy said. So definitely check out the show notes wherever you're listening to the podcast for the promo code. It's definitely a fantastic course. I'm not just saying this because Mandy is my friend and colleague. It's truly, she put so much into this course and it's really, really valuable information. So highly would recommend it. Especially if that's an area that you and or your loved ones can work on, can use help with. And I feel like we all can. I
Totally.
feel like I could also benefit from
Sure.
going back through it too. So
But also just talk about being vulnerable.
a little
Vulnerable
bit.
to offer that. It's vulnerable to put my clinical experience out into a course, but I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that it's helpful for y'all. But we'll definitely share all of the resources that we talked about today. And just in closing, you're not alone in this. It is hard to be human and it's raw, it's real, it's exposing, but it's brave, it's courageous, you're strong, you've got this. So Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to having you around next time.
Yeah, thanks so much and see you next time.